So this is a little weird because this movie came out years ago, and a lot of critics, not big critics, but smaller critics, people on YouTube, people who enjoy movies. The a lot of opinion that I've seen is that this movie Boyhood is a movie, and that it's boring. That was a sort of a fleeting consensus that existed and exists, and I don't disagree. The reason I'm talking about Boyhood, though, because I'm not dismissing it as just a boring movie, is because it is a philosophical movie. It has hints of complexity, and it very much warrants serious discussion, which is why it's here. If you don't know, Boyhood is the movie about a boy, and it was filmed over the course of 12 years, and you see this kid growing up right before your eyes. It's the same actors. It took them 12 years to film. They got together like every year and filmed the scene. This is Richard Linklater. He's the director. It's the same guy. He uses Ethan Hawke in all his movies, and they're all very sort of not a lot happens in his movies, but Before Midnight and Before Sunset and all that stuff. There's some social discussion. There's a little bit of social commentary, not that much, but it's mostly just his approach. I find it's just like, here's life. Take a look. It's very upfront about that. It's like a lot of movies will have general problems and obstacles for characters to overcome, and he doesn't do that. He just sort of creates, here's the life of this character, just the everyday life of it. And some people would have a problem with that, but so I typically don't. I liked Richard Linklater's other movies. I liked Before Midnight. I thought it was very well written, and I thought it was interesting, even though it didn't really have these sort of big obstacles for characters to overcome, because you know what? It's not necessary. A movie doesn't have to be good to have big obstacles, big challenges for a character. That stuff is good fuel for intense drama and melodrama and all sorts of dramatic funhousery, but it's not necessary. And there are some subtle nuances of life and the complexity of life that you can explore just by doing what Richard Linklater does and just having the average everyday thing. The smaller, subtler nuances are actually ignored if you go to the over-dramatization end, where everything is epic, everything is important, everything is huge, and there's explosions, and character has to fight off, everyone, and all that heroic, epic stuff. But interesting. If it's interesting, it should be interesting regardless of how sort of overtly dramatic it is, at least I think. And my theory with aesthetics for the longest time has been, and this is important because this is what I'm trying to look at here, the theory has been that so long as it's realistic, then it's interesting. And what that means is specific, and I'll sort of explain why I don't think this movie's realistic later on. But, the movie's boring. It's boring as hell. Red Letter Media did a review of it years ago, or a year ago, I don't remember, and they said it was boring. They exaggerated how boring it was, I think, but it's generally, they had a point. It's very, what they did, what it felt like was what they did. At the start of the movie, there was a bit more structure. It felt like it was going places. The second half of the movie, what it felt like was there's a whole bunch of years of this kid's life. It's filmed over 15, 12 years or something. They took a random day in each year, and they just filmed what this kid did on that day. And then they went to the next year, picked another random day, and filmed what he did that year. And then kept going until the very end. And at the end, there was a bit more plot structure, but the middle, the vast majority of the film, was just like this. They took a random day, and so there's an obvious problem with that for any kind of dramatization. Dramatization involves build-up, and it involves development, it involves progression, but what this does is it creates this sort of scene in completion. Like, a scene will happen, and once it's done, any all the information that it presented just doesn't matter. It just gets wiped. It's like it's like you're writing code, and then you just you hit Control A, and then delete everything. Everything is reset because they skip over to the next year, and now there's new things happening, and so there's no tension, there's no progression, there's no dramaticism, there's nothing. It's just anything that develops is immediately met with disappointment because it's always shut down as you move on to the next scene. This, it's the inherent problem with what they designed with this movie, is that they did that. This was the whole point of the movie. The theme was to just show this kid growing up. It's to just show him growing up. Take random days of his life and show him growing up. This movie might as well have been a documentary, a non-fiction documentary. There's almost no point of it to be fiction in that case, since you're not really even telling a story. There's more, like, at least with a kid, you're not telling a story. People commented that Ethan Hawke and what's her name? The Arquette chick, I forget her first name. The mother and father, they were interesting characters, and they were going through interesting stuff, and they had good performances, and if the stories were about them, that would have been interesting. And you actually do see those characters mature, and there's something about those characters, something definitively unique about them, that you don't really have with this kid. And so that raises another interesting point, which I'm going to get to. It's the interesting point is that teenagers or not like kids are inherently uninteresting. That's the conclusion that you can take from this idea. This is a story about a kid, but the only interesting characters are the non-kids, so kids are just inherently uninteresting. But I don't even agree with that. I think kids and teenagers can be interesting, and in fact they are interesting in other works. In Game of Thrones, the books, not the show. In the books, a lot of the characters are very young. Arya, Rob, and they're going through a lot of stuff, and it's not interesting just because there's war and violence that they have to deal with. They're going through personal stuff, in every single chapter, and personal growth, and you can sense this personal growth even though these kids are insanely young. I at least did not feel any kind of personal growth for this kid because you're not shown any personal growth. Again, every single scene happens, and then the information that's presented in that scene is reset. Like, I remember there was a scene where the kid, he's talking to some girl, and she's like, "Oh, are you gonna go to a party this weekend?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, maybe we'll see. Maybe he'll do something at the party, and we'll get to learn a bit about him. Is he awkward at parties? Is he social? Is he introverted? Is he extroverted? Is he thinking? Is he feeling? Personality traits. Do we learn anything about that? No, nothing happens. He doesn't go to the party. It skips over a year, and he's like hanging out with some like drunk high school kids. It's just, and the movie consistently does this, and so you never really learn about this kid as a person, like you do about Robb Stark and Arya Stark and all those Jon Snow and all those characters, all those lovely characters, and Joffrey, all those lovely characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. You learn all about them, even though you're only with them for 1 year. You learn very little about this kid. He feels like a caricature at one point. His only definitive personality trait is that he's interested in photography. That's the only thing that comes to mind as something that is unique about him, is that he is interested in photography. But that's what he does. That's not who he is. If you can catch the difference there. So I'm really my sort of thesis here is that this kid was not presented as a realistic character, and that's the ultimate downfall of this movie. If he was a realistic character, then it would have been interesting. A realistic character is an interesting character. Period. Which is what the theory. That's at least what my theory says. Other things to note. I mean, I felt at the end of the movie, I felt like there might be a good ending. Like there might be some philosophical gravitas at the end. Like when he ends up in college and he meets a girl, and I thought, oh, maybe in the conversation with the girl that he meets in college, we're gonna get the sense that she is kind of like this kid's mother, and he is kind of like the kid's father, and so we're gonna get that mirror situation where his mother and father are they live through the same thing that he's living through now, or they're similar, or there's this parallel between the past generation and the current generation and what he does in college. Because I remember there's a line where they mentioned that his mother and father met in college, and I thought, oh, cool. Then when he ends up in college, they can draw that parallel there, and it might be, and that would be nice and that would be touching. But they didn't do that. The kid and the girl he meets, they're just, they're there's nothing. There's very little characterization of either of them. They didn't do that. In fact, if they did that, that would have actually changed the theme of the story. Suddenly, it wouldn't have been about him simply growing up. It would have been also about how he grew up into his parents, which isn't apparently not the idea that Richard Linklater wanted to get across. The one character trait, like, let's just try, like, as an exercise to anyone who's seen the movie, try and characterize this kid. I seriously want to know what kind of person he is. Because the only things I can think of is he's interested in photography and he's quiet. That's it. That's the only definitive things about him. He's calm and quiet. He's never really angry, upset. Well, no, he gets upset, but he doesn't get angry. He doesn't get overly enthusiastic, overly sort of outwardly emotional. He's just quiet. And those are, some interesting superficial traits, about a character. It's like this character's quiet, but this is something you learn about a character the second they walk into a scene, as soon as this character is in the scene, you will get the sense that they're quiet. That's not something that's not something that can't be the only thing that defines their character. So what defines this kid's character? Is he a good person? Is he a bad person? Is he loving? Is he empathetic? Is he a thinking type person, sort of logical thinking, or is he more emotional? Is he introverted? Is he nerdy? Is he extroverted? Is he popular at school? Is he incredibly unpopular at school? Does he get bullied? Does he not get bullied? Actually, that's another thing I'd point out. There was a situation where he was getting bullied at school. There was one scene in this bathroom where he's getting bullied, and I'm like, oh damn, something's about to happen. He's going to have an altercation with this bully, and the altercation with the bully is going to somehow impact his fucking emotional development, and it's going to affect the way he behaves throughout the rest of the movie. It doesn't. It means nothing. It means nothing in his life, nothing in any of the other scenes. It's just... It feels pointless. You get that idea that things feel pointless. There are scenes that feel pointless in this game, in this movie, and you don't ever want to have that in a movie. Even if it's all about him growing up, everything should feel like it has a point. And that's not subjective either. Anyway. So yeah, like character traits. Thinking, feeling, introverted, extroverted. I can't... Obviously, he hasn't gone through any kind of big trauma, but he has any kind of emotional issue. What are his thoughts on politics? And this could go on. And if you know psychology, and you can think of various, is he conscientious? Is he very organized and conscientious and sort of lawful, or does he disrespect authority and is Is his learning area a complete mess, or we don't get any of that. We don't get the sense of like what his room looks like and what he does in his room. We don't really learn about that. It goes on and on. The list goes on and on. Characterizing a person. So I mean, what this boils down to is that he doesn't feel like a real person. It's not that he doesn't feel like a good character. Because I maintain the theory is that if it's a real person, if it feels like a real person, then it will make a good character. Not looking at the theme or whatever, it will make an interesting character. That's the idea. That's the thesis, or that's the theorem that I have in my mind, is that if this is a well-written, realistically written person, then they will always make, guaranteed to make an interesting character. Not looking at the plot or the theme or the point of the story or the setting or anything, but an individual that is realistically written will always make an interesting character. And what that suggests is that realistically written literature, a realistically written story, will always make an interesting story. Because the only thing that determines whether something's interesting or not is whether or not it's realistic. And realistic doesn't mean what you might think it means, that it has to be gritty or something. No, realistic just means it doesn't have to have pain or suffering or anything. Realistic just means it has to be honest and upfront and analytical, incredibly analytical about all of the subtle nuances that go into a character's personality, their life, their everyday thing, all of the subtle nuances and complexity that are involved in their day-to-day activities and in their being, their essence. If you can get all of that subtlety, all that complexity across, if you can get across the subtlety and complexity of real life, because then it's realistic, and then it's interesting. It's in other words, realism suggests that there is an honest expression of all the subtle complexities of real life, which are interesting to look at in literature and in art. It is something that is fundamentally interesting to us, to audiences, to viewers, if we understand these subtleties and complexities, that is, or if we're interested in understanding them and learning about them. So this story doesn't do that. Inarguably, it doesn't do that, because this character, this person, doesn't feel like a character. They don't feel like a human being. They don't... there are no, or very few, subtle complexities of his life. The only complexity to his life is that he's getting older. And he's kind of quiet. And he likes photography. That's it. There's nothing about him that feels uniquely his, because you could just say, oh, he's just an average guy. No. There are no average people. Every single person is an individual. Every single person is unique. Every single person has something to them and about them that is uniquely theirs and nobody else's, except maybe a twin who's had very similar upbringing. Like, this could have worked better, and I could almost see it working well. I can almost see it working well in my head if what they did was they really tried to show how this kid grew and the kind of person that he was. But they didn't want to show the kind of person he was, they just wanted to show the fact that he grew. And the simple act of growing isn't enough to warrant, a movie, a 2.5 hour long movie about it. The simple act of growing, that should be something that's on the Discovery Channel. How people grow and how people change. That's something that is of academic interest, not of aesthetic interest, not of artistic interest. Like, it would have worked maybe if they looked at, maybe instead of taking a random day from this kid's year, what they could have done is they could have divided it into 3 sections. The first section, you have him when he's very young, and you learn a bit about him when he's young, and then the midsection, you sort of get to see how he's a little older and the issues he has to deal with, and then the last section when he's older, that should be the longest section, and you see the kind of person, you see him becoming a person in this final section. You see him growing up. You see how the traits that he had and developed, and the first signs and subtle inklings of character development, of human psychological development that you see in the earlier scenes are re-represented and developed further in the latter scenes when he's older, when he's grown up, when you see the person that he's become or becoming. That would have made a great movie. And if that was filmed over 12 years, that would have made a fantastic movie, actually. That would have not been boring. That would have been interesting. If you could see the structure and the development and the subtleties of his personality. But you don't get that. Instead, you get a lot of scenes that don't do anything other than show a random thing he did in his life. And it's not true that teenagers aren't interesting or can't make interesting characters. I think anything remotely human can make an interesting character. Even kids can make not interesting characters, but interesting would-be characters. When I was a kid, I was really interested in drawing and visual learning, and I can still sort of feel how that's affected me now and today, and how I'm still so heavily visually oriented, and I like certain kinds of paintings and landscapes and bright colors, and in fact that painting back there and with the orange, that's something I painted. I used to paint, and I'm not saying I'm not a good painter, but it's something I used to do, and it's affected me today, and I can feel how it's affected me today. And it would be nice if we could look at this kid and feel how the person he was at the end, came from the person he was at the beginning, how it developed. If we could feel that, The teenagers are interesting. There's been interesting movies and stories about teenagers. The Breakfast Club is a good movie, It's a little, there's a few, contrivances in it. It's a little... there's no contrivances in Boyhood, obviously, but there's a few contrivances in Breakfast Club, and it's a little cheesy, but there's characters in it, right? Those are teenagers, but they are characters. They are individuals. You know what they care. You learn about them. They're not just their stereotypes. That was the whole point of the movie. There's another movie, I forget what it's called. I think it's called Something Wrong with Kevin, but it has Tilda Swinton and her son, and he grows up to be a maddening psychopath and kills a bunch of people with a bow and arrow. But that movie also had a kid growing up, and you see him growing up. Granted, the point of that movie was that there was something wrong with him, and you could tell from the beginning, but that's still more interesting, because there's structure there. There's no structure to this kid, When they said he's good at photography, that was random to me. I'm like, oh, okay. That's random, but at least that's something. At least he has an interest. So I guess I could give the movie credit for at least trying to give him something uniquely his, photography. But it wasn't enough, I'd say, and it just felt sort of out of place, and it didn't add anything to anything. Because there's nothing to add to. The photography thing didn't add to him growing up, and they weren't trying to make a statement about this character. They weren't trying to make any kind of statement about this character other than the fact that he was growing up. They might as well have not had him be a photographer. Before Midnight is a great movie. Also Richard Linklater, but that's a great movie. And it also has Ethan Hawke, and that movie could literally be considered a movie where all they show is just real life. It's just real life. There's no big dramatic events. It's just plain old boring real life. But it's still interesting. That's the thing. That movie is still somehow interesting. It starts off with a 20-minute long shot. Not a scene, a shot. A single shot where Ethan Hawke and his wife just talk about things. And that talk is by itself already there's so much information that goes on in that scene, and so much character development, and it's so much more interesting than any fucking conversation that this kid has in this movie at all. He starts talking about weird philosophical stuff at the end, and it's just kind of out of place and strange, and He breaks up with his girlfriend, and it's all just. I mean, I lost my train of thought. But you will get this sense if you watch this movie. The vast majority of people will get this. Vast majority of analytical people will get the sense, because people who are analytical, they're going to watch this movie, they're going to analyze the scenes, and they're going to try and figure out, okay, what is this movie trying to tell me? What is this movie what questions is it asking? What answers is it presenting? What is it trying to get me to feel? They're going to be introspective, and they're going to start inspecting, analyzing the movie. And they're going to feel that there isn't that much stuff that's being analyzed here. The people who are just going to watch this and like it are the people who are, either apologists or people who just don't analyze and just see the idea that, oh, it's filmed over 12 years, how cool, and they're just going to like it based on that. The structural problem with him not being a character, there are stories where the main character, the story's not about him. These stories do exist. The stories, these are stories where there's a narrator, where the main character is simply a narrator and he's narrating the story of someone else. The Great Gatsby, for a good example of that. The main character is a narrator, he's not doing things are happening to him. And that's perfectly fine. The narrators tend to feel more like they aren't agents, but like they don't have agency, like things are acting upon them. Things are constantly happening to them, they are not doing anything. That's how this kid feels at the start. It feels like the story isn't really about him, he's just there and we're seeing it from his perspective. That was fine. In later scenes, the story sort of tried to become about him. But it doesn't work because there is no him for the story to be about. He isn't a character. Again, it's the whole problem with, like, thematically the story is about him, because the story is about this kid growing up. That is the theme of the story. This is a kid growing up. But the setting, it's not really about him. Even in the scenes that he's in, almost all of them have all of this complexity and all this shit happening with his dad, with his mom, even in the later scenes, when you see his dad and his mom, you see his dad and his mom when they're older and they're divorced and they have their own husbands and wives, and the mom gets married and remarried like 6 times over, and then she talks to that, she talks to that Mexican guy who's laying pipe, and then he becomes like a manager at a restaurant or something. And it was cheesy, but there was so much shit going on over there. This kid had nothing going on. He was a photographer. That's the only thing that was going on. Anytime anything was about to go on with him, it stopped going on. He was about to get bullied, but then nothing happens. He's about to go to a party with a girl, and then nothing happens. He and his friend, there's a fucking scene where he and his middle school friend are throwing like saw blades at a piece of wood, and with 2 like high school students that are making fun of him. And it blew my mind, because that entire scene wasn't even about the kid. It was about these 2 high school students bullying his friend and talking shit to his friend about they were saying things like, oh, you never slept with a girl, you're a loser, and they kept teasing him and calling him a pussy, and it was just like, oh wow, they're actually bullying this kid. But they weren't bullying the main character. The main character just sat there and just like he was dark in the background. Everything in the scene that was happening wasn't happening to him. It was happening to the other characters in the scene. And that also goes nowhere, because these characters are never heard from or seen again. And there's also, they ask the main character, I forget the names, I'm sorry, but they ask the main character what his favorite, whether he slept with a woman before, and he's like, he says yeah, several times, and I'm actually curious, he's in 8th grade, so they probably answers no, he hasn't, but I'm curious as to whether or not he lied about that, and why they didn't go into the movie didn't really try to explore how much he wanted to fit in with these older high school students, or whether or not he was intimidated by them, whether or not he lied, whether or not he wanted to lie, how much did he want to sleep with a girl to give himself street cred. There's so much stuff that could have like created. Like that's already a story in and of itself. Whether or not he, a young teenager, tweenager, middle schooler, high schooler would lie about getting laid, and there's nothing. This kid, none of that happened. They just skipped the next year when he's going off to college, whatever, or he's coming home after a party. There's a scene, like, and the more I think about it, the more I think I'm right. Like, there's a scene where he was at a party. He comes home after the party, and it's his birthday, and he talks to his mom, and it's suggested that the mom is now married to this ex-war veteran guy, and the kid just came home from his birthday, and he has a short conversation with his mom, and then he goes to sleep, and then they skip to the next year, the next, like, jump in time. And it's like, nothing in that scene has anything to do with the kid. Everything that happens in that scene is about the mother and the fact that she's now with this war veteran and how her life has changed. The kid's life doesn't look or feel like it's changed at all. He's still a quiet kid. He's quiet the whole movie. At no point is he not quiet. And there's no other character traits other than the photography, which comes in later. And then he has a conversation with his teacher and his teacher tells him, it's like, he wants to be a photographer, and his teacher tells him how life is hard or whatever, or you're not going to succeed, or you're going to have to do yada yada blah. And then the kid just, again, that doesn't matter either. The kid just goes on doing his photography. It's like that scene felt like the teacher had more going on in his life than this actual kid. And that's the general problem, is that this entire time, even as he's growing up, it feels like nothing is happening. Like, there are things happening around him. There's all sorts of crazy things happening around him. Nothing is happening to him. He's not doing anything. There's nothing special about him. There's nothing unique about him. There's nothing character, realistic, subtle about him. There's nothing subtle about him, really. Nothing. Unless it's so subtle that I haven't been able to piece it together. In which case, please, by all means, somebody explain it in the comments section if you've seen this movie. What subtleties I missed. But I swear to God, if they exist, they are so damn subtle that you would need an electron microscope to fucking see them. In theme, the story is about him, because he's growing up. But in setting, in plot, it's not. Because in setting and in plot, things are happening to characters, subtleties exist with the other characters, with their performances, with their writing, with their stories. But in setting, nothing's happening to him. In fact, in setting, he isn't even a character. He's barely a human being. He is a quiet kid that likes photography. Two character traits, which are 1.5 dimensional at best. 1 dimensional, really. That's the problem. The theme says it's about this kid growing up, but the plot says, the setting says, it's not really about him at all. It's about all this other shit that happens around him. He's not even a person. You can make interesting stories about kids growing up. You really could. This could have been an interesting story if they tried to really make him a unique person. I felt like they deliberately tried not to do that. They just tried to make him as vague an individual as possible, and just see how everyone else grows up. And this movie had a lot of things happening around the kid. You get to see him talking about Star Wars and Harry Potter and all of these things and it's like going back through history and seeing how things were, back then, a little bit. But there's nothing about him that's particularly unique. Or he has no personhood, no agency, no whatever. I've made my point. And it's because of this point that I think that this story does not violate the rule, the theorem that real life is interesting so long as it's realistic. So sorry, a story is interesting so long as it's realistic, so long as it's authentic, so long as it honestly and accurately and analytically presents the subtle complexities of real life, which is how I define realism. If it can do this, if it can get all of those subtleties across, which is not an easy thing to do in writing, it's not something that's trivial by any means, but if it can do this, it will be interesting. And it doesn't matter if there's action, if there's death, if there's no crazy drama, or even if there's minor, subtle, everyday, boring social issues. And I say boring facetiously. It doesn't matter if there's big drama with big world-changing events, or small drama with family-level events, or barely any drama. Just everyday altercations or small things, small everyday happenings. You know, the day-to-day life of person X. That can still be interesting so long as all the subtle complexities are carried across within the writing and the storytelling and the filming and the lighting and blah, 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 blah. Wasn't done here, and that's the ultimate flaw. And I hope that theorem is true, because what that suggests is that every single person's life, every single person on Earth, every single person's life is interesting. Every single person's life makes for an interesting story. You know, Boyhood, and why I was so worried about it, was that it suggested that wasn't true. It suggested that there were some people whose lives were just so boring that they didn't matter or they weren't interesting, because that's how this movie felt. It was boring, right? But my conclusion from this is that no, people's lives, even everyday people's lives, are not uninteresting or boring. It was just presented in a way that made it boring because there was nothing realistic or authentic about it that would have made it interesting, right? And that real life, even mundane real life, can still make for interesting storytelling. It can, and it does, and it's a very life-affirming sort of philosophy, because it suggests every human being's life is good enough. Every single person is good enough to be the lead character in a story. You know, every single person's life can make its own book. That's very life-affirming. And I believe that. And I do not believe that Boyhood has damaged that ideal. And I'm going to stick to that ideal for now. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Cheers.